remember this Sunday, right? The Sunday when the music died. You know, it's, these things do happen. 2 Corinthians chapter, I'm going to forget my stuff now. But I mean, I do appreciate everyone and anyone that comes up here. And I mean, it's one thing to sit in the pew and watch people and do their thing. And you're like, this can't be that hard. And then you come up here, and then stuff happens. You know, it's amazing. In fact, I don't think we read our scripture either. We're forgetting everything today, so, there's that. So maybe Luke, maybe a little bit later after, maybe we can kind of grab that. So I do promise it's not normally like this if you're not normally with us. But I do appreciate everyone that comes up here and risks embarrassment, so to speak. It is service rendered to the King, and sometimes you appreciate that when the Bible says, make a joyful noise unto the Lord, and it is truly a joyful noise that God honors, not perfection. And so I appreciate everyone and anyone who comes to do this, and it is service, it is worship, and we're thankful for everyone that does so. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we're going to be looking at verses really 1 through 8. I think it says 1 through 7 up there, but it's 1 through 8. Continuing our series here. And why do you think that Jesus used so many parables and used treasure to illustrate the point that he was after? I don't know if that always resonates with us the way that it should, but there's just, I think, something that appeals to the human heart when we refer to treasure, and we get it. We understand treasure. We understand the longing that our heart has for that, and they're life-changing. We know that treasure can change me. It can be a life-changing moment. It can be restorative. It can help me accomplish something and do something. But you think about, like Jesus talked about, the pearl of great price and how that individual was willing to sell everything he possibly could to obtain that one singular treasure, this pearl of great price. Or the one who walks and finds the field and the treasure in the field, and he sells everything he has so we can acquire that field, so we can acquire that treasure because it's greater than anything else that he has. Or even maybe the parable of the talents, or the parable really of the lost coin or the lost sheep. They're all dealing in some capacity with what we would call wealth or treasure. Why does that appeal to us? Why does that appeal to us the way that it does? We like treasure. We get it. We know and understand the allure that has on us. And you think about gold has been valuable really forever. It may have escaped your notice, but when you read through the first couple chapters of Genesis, you'll notice that it's highlighted. There was gold there, it says. So even in the Garden of Eden, prior to the fall, it's mentioned there's gold there. Why is that mentioned? Because even we realized it was precious, it was significant, it was beautiful. Solomon had so much gold in his kingdom that he devalued silver. It was worthless. Why did he want so much gold? But he had it. It's been long used in jewelry and hoarded in safes. People look at it as being recession-proof when things aren't going so well. Like you hang on to gold, you acquire gold. Why do we want that? When you think about how gold is not particularly useful. We make jewelry out of it. We maybe sometimes coat electronics with it. But what do we really do with gold? We decorate. You know what's a lot more useful? Iron and steel. It built the world that we now know. It holds this building together with the nails and the screws. It's part of the light fixtures that we have. It's sometimes inside of our bodies, or will be tomorrow, right? Like we understand these kinds of things. Like we do so much with other metals, and yet it's gold, this treasure that we value more so than anything else, and people are willing to sacrifice and give and work hard to obtain it. Why do we love treasure so much? I don't really have a great answer for you. But for some people, that treasure becomes something that actually owns us. And gold has certainly owned a lot of people over the years. They will do absolutely anything to acquire it, and they don't want to let go of it. They can't. It owns them. They don't own it. It can be really hard to let it go, but that was not true for the Macedonians who appear now in our text this morning. They seem to have the opposite problem. They can't help but get rid of it. And Paul's not really taking issue with gold or the acquiring of gold or the having of gold or any of those kinds of things, but really the reality of the hold that treasure can have on us. We live in such a material world. We love possessions. We love stuff. It's easy for that stuff to own us, and the Macedonians demonstrate what has to be true for that not to be true. What's different about us as believers, or what should be different about us as believers, so that treasure, that we can hold treasure in our hands, and yet at the same time say, hey, Lord, how can I see this as a tool and not an end in and of itself? And we see that. We see that taking place here. And I tried to rework this a couple of times. I just couldn't do it, but I couldn't sum this passage up any better than what John Piper said about this. He said this: love is the overflow of joy and the grace of God that meets the needs of others. Love is the overflow of joy and the grace of God that meets the needs of others. And all of those words come from this passage somewhere. And I think that really sums this up better than anything I could ever come up with. But love is really an action word. It should compel us to do something. And the Macedonians had a love, not just for their fellow man, but truly a love for God. And it compelled them to action. And it should also compel us to action too. So this morning we want to look at how that played out in the lives of the Macedonians, but more importantly, why. Why did that play out in the lives of the Macedonians? So let's read. We're just going to start with the first 5 verses and then make some comments. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in the severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Very first, the need for love demonstrated. The need for love demonstrated. And we're going to see that now as we go here. Really what we find is just dire straits. I think we can sympathize with that right now, at least to a point. We've all been feeling the shortages. We've all been feeling the price increases of other things. And like our paycheck hasn't gotten any bigger, but our expenses have certainly increased. Friday, I think it was, I went online and went to, it was Aldi, and I said, what's the price of eggs? Because that's, the big thing all the time. It was almost $5. I mean, almost $5 a dozen. It's crazy. And then Pam on Saturday, just out of the blue, says, hey, it was like Walmart. They're coming down. They're 3-something. I'm like, whoa. It's, you think about the Easter breakfast, we're going to have like armed guards guarding the scrambled egg table. It's like hundreds of dollars sitting there. Like, no, you get one scoop, you're done. Like, what happened? What happened? Like all this, all the prices are extreme, and we understand that. And it's not just eggs; it's like everything. And we feel that. Like, the dollar just doesn't go as far as it used to, even just a couple years ago. We understand a little bit more what it means to be need, or when things are just not available to us sometimes, or eventually maybe, but not right away. In Paul's time, there was a massive need, the likes of which I don't think any of us have ever experienced and cannot really fully comprehend. And it's hard to know exactly how bad things really were for them at that moment in time. But one of the things that always helps us go through difficult times is the fact that in our modern age, we've learned how to store food in ways they couldn't have dreamed. We know how to can things. We know how to freeze things. We know how to dry things. We can make food last for like years and years and years. And we know how to transport stuff like really well, really fast. It's really helped keep prices much more in check and availability, so that when famine or something terrible happens, like it's not as bad as what it would be. That wasn't true then. There was a famine in a place here in the time of the New Testament, or even really for 1,000 years after that it was really bad. We don't understand what that was like, but Jerusalem is experiencing, or about to experience, a time like that. Jerusalem is going to experience a severe famine. The offering or collection that's being discussed here is to help go to Jerusalem in that area, to help relieve that famine, to help those struggling families in those churches there. And we actually read about this a bit in Acts chapter 11. You can turn there, but it should be behind me. But Acts chapter 11 actually details some of this. And it says this: Now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over all the world. And this took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul, it would be Paul, And it says all over the world, but it's interesting to me that they interpret that basically, let's send all our proceeds to Judea, to basically Jerusalem. Why? Because I think it's going to be where the center, where it's going to be most felt, is going to be. But they're raising funds to do this and to help out with that. And what happened? Well, can't be 100% sure of all the details and ins and outs, but it seems like there was a severe flood actually in Egypt about 46 AD that wiped out. Egypt, if you understand, was the breadbasket for the ancient world, or much of the ancient world. So much grain came from that area. So when Egypt had a bad year, everybody had a bad year. And so in 46 AD, severe flooding wiped out a lot of the crops, had like severe shortages, and Jerusalem, Israel being right there, would have felt that faster and more deeply than anybody else who had a much more diversified food supply. They're going to feel that. And there's probably other things going on there too. But what you might not realize, that Paul is going to be involved in raising funds for this relief for over a decade. So understand how deeply this is affecting the church in Jerusalem, how dire things probably are in the church in Jerusalem and that surrounding area as he's doing this. It's bad. It's really, really bad. So this is the offering that he's talking about. But even though they're in dire straits, it also has put forward an amazing opportunity. You know, in general circumstances like these, people like to ask the question, why? Why does God allow this kind of suffering? Why does God allow these things to happen? Why does God allow his chosen people, his special people, the Jews, to experience this? Why does God allow the early church, really starting in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, why does God allow them to have that happen to them? Why not just let them, why is God not just blessing them greatly so that the gospel could go out and they can do their thing? Instead, the early church is only like a decade old at this point. Give or take, maybe a little bit older, but it's young, it's early. It's not well established. And then he puts on their shoulders a crushing famine. You can imagine early believers going like, what do we do? Why is this happening to us? You'd have to ask God that question. Many times we do. But you also all question and doubt whether we'll ever actually get an answer. I'm thankful to have never faced this kind of famine or desperation. You should be too. But even though Joseph is nowhere to be found to help them lead through this, there's Agabus. The Christians at least did have a leg up. They had some early warning to maybe start making some provisions and adjustments in this. But this is going to affect everybody, not just the Christians. But these Jewish Christians in Jerusalem are now benefiting from the generosity of the Gentile churches. Imagine, they're benefiting from the people that they've tried to avoid their entire lives. The people they look at, you're unclean. I don't know if you knew that or not, but you're unclean. Now they're dependent on them. I think if you want any kind of answer and explanation, at least from human perspective, you want to talk about a way in which you can galvanize and unite the church across all kinds of demographics and ethnicities and everything else that's out there, you put it in severe affliction and suffering, and all of a sudden God says, look, you have to work together. You have to come together. You have to do this or you're going to die. And the people that have been the most standoffish for their entire existence is the Jewish people, these now Jewish Christians, and all of a sudden they need these Gentile Christians in their lives or they're not going to make it. Rather than fracturing the church, God is bringing it together and cementing it together through severe affliction. I think that's the reason why. And suddenly, like all this, the world is the Good Samaritan, and the Jewish church is the man on the ground that's been beaten. Christians have never made their generosity about ethnicity or anything else. Later Christians are going to come alongside and help many, many other people. They're going to come alongside those who were suffering. They didn't care if they were Christians. They didn't care if they were pagans. They didn't care if they were Jews or Gentiles or church folk or from the neighborhood or whatever. They helped everybody. They really did. And it made an amazing impact for the gospel. Eusebius of Caesarea, an early church historian, recorded that during the plague in the 4th century, that Christians were coming alongside. Basically, people from the main cities left. They were going into the countryside. They wanted to get away from anybody and everything they possibly could. And it was those that remained behind that were those that they were too sick to get out. And then there were the Christians who stayed behind and willfully took care of those who were sick, taking food sometimes out of their own mouths, and they were starving. It's not like they had a lot to eat, but they're like, I'm going to take this piece of bread that I want to eat desperately, and I'm going to give it to this person who cannot do anything to help himself. The Christians stayed there. The Christians took care of the sick and the poor and the dying. They were there. And imagine that impact. Everybody looks around, why are you still here? Because of Christ. They had a testimony. They had a testimony when everybody else ran. They stayed. Years later, decades later after that, Julian the Apostate, he's the last pagan emperor. I think that what it means really is that Constantine was the next one. But he recognized that Christian compassion had an amazing effect on the empire. He wasn't happy about it because it was threatening all the other pagan religions and temples and everything else like this. But he says this: when it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the pagan priests, then I think the impious Galileans, which he meant by Christians, observed that this fact and devoted themselves to philanthropy. They support not only their poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us. It was the Christians. It was the Christians through severe persecution and trials and all that. They were the ones staying behind, and they helped everybody. He tried to get his own pagan priests, all the other groups, and he said, come together, do this. And you know what? They didn't have the same motivating factors. They didn't have Christ as an example who put a towel around his waist and served other people. They don't have that in their religion. They don't have that as a model, an example to follow. They don't have any of the reasoning that we as Christians do. And so the Christians were just modeling what Jesus did for them. And they didn't have that. And it has this deep impact all across the Roman Empire because they're like, what would Jesus do? He would do that. They can't say that. What would Zeus do? What would Mars do? They can't say those things. They don't have those things. They didn't have models of servant leadership and self-sacrifice. So you see all these famines and all these hardships and everything else serve to spread the gospel to places that might not have known it otherwise. But hardship, you understand, is never enough. Hardship in and of itself doesn't spread the gospel. Hardship doesn't make better people. It was the Christian's response to that hardship that made all the difference. You know, it's a common warning that pastors give to pastors. Be very, very careful before you tell your people, be like whatever. Be like Daniel. Be like Paul. Be like the Macedonians. Be like whatever. Be very careful because we're not holding up these people and say, be like this. Paul's not even saying that with the Macedonians here as we get into our passage a little bit deeper. He's not saying that. We need to get behind it. What made the Macedonians the Macedonians? It was their view of God. It's how they saw God. That's what we need to see as well. What motivated them to do this and be like this. That's what we're supposed to see. And what we find behind that is this. It was response of love that was shown. The response of love shown. There was this movement that was taking place in Macedonia. Macedonia, if you remember, we had a map up here a few weeks ago, but it was, you have Corinth down here towards the south end, right there on the coast. It was a port city, lots of ships going in and out and everything else like that. But Macedonia was much more further north, much more landlocked than a lot of those other places. Would have included churches like Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea. Those would have been churches. There might have been more, but it was at least those three. Part of still Greece, but Macedonia. Up there doing their thing. And those churches have human generosity that Paul sees really is coming from the very hand of God. God had moved them by his grace to be generous. And you're going to notice that this grace comes up in both chapters 8 and 9. Paul sometimes kind of plays with the definition of that a little bit. It's not necessarily always talking about receiving what you don't deserve. Sometimes it's just talking about favor. Sometimes he really is just talking about generosity, yet it's a generosity that he sees coming from the very hand of God. But what's most amazing is that these Macedonians are giving generously from funds they didn't have. That test of affliction that we see being mentioned here in verse 2 for severe test of affliction, I think it's a reference to their extreme poverty. I can't swear by that. Nobody's really sure if Paul's making multiple things or just that's what he's talking about. But you have to understand the Macedonians didn't just give. They didn't just give generously. They gave joyfully. They gave joyfully out of poverty, out of what they did not have. I heard this story. I thought it was Scott Williquette, and he denied it, so I don't know where I heard it. Maybe you can help me. There was a missionary who was traveling, I want to say South America somewhere, visiting, a small area church, going to teach there, do some things for a while. And, just making casual conversation, how are you doing, how are you sleeping, and your accommodation's okay, and just not wanting to complain, but his back was bothering because he's sleeping on the floor, strange places, you know how that stuff goes. And one of the people in attendance heard that and says, well, we have a bed. And he goes home and he got his mattress that he and his wife were sleeping on, put it on his back and walked miles so the missionary could sleep on it so his back wouldn't hurt while he was there visiting with them. And you think about that, the missionary is a combination of embarrassed and flattered, and he's like, no, that's not what I meant. If you come to me and tell me you're not sleeping well, your back hurts, best you're going to get from me is an Advil. You know what I mean? It's just how we go. We do. I'm not putting my bed on my back and walking to your house. I don't care if you're my neighbor. I'm not doing it. You're not either. Be honest. And this man, who probably has almost nothing to his name, but he had a bed, and he puts it on his back, and he travels over who knows how many miles, and delivers this bed, this mattress to this missionary's door, so the missionary, this man of God, could sleep on it. Those who have the least give the most, often. Another way to illustrate this is one that you actually saw firsthand here a few years ago for our Christmas program that the kids put on every year. If you remember, the richest family in town. I don't know how many years ago. It's been a couple. But that play that they performed up here, Pastor Thomas is the fictional character, I think he's fictional, character in 1949, keep in mind. But he decides with his church, he says, hey, let's gather together, we'll raise funds over the next 4 weeks from Thanksgiving till Christmas. We'll gather together, we'll raise these funds, and we'll collect it, and we'll give it to the poorest family in town, whatever it happens to be. And then people, of course, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea, charity work and whatnot. And this family that's in this church is like, hey, well, we could give something. They didn't have much. But they started kind of coming up with creative ways and thinking, I can rake leaves. They start raking everybody's leaves that they can find, raking leaves, and all the money he got from that, he put in a little jar that they were going to give to the church so they could give to the poorest family in town. And then other individuals in that family said, well, I can do something. So the one girl, the daughter was babysitting, so she's taking all the babysitting money and putting it in the jar. And they said, well, we got Grandma's fudge recipe. It's amazing. I hate fudge, so it's hard for me to believe, but you might like it. But we'll sell this. We'll sell this, right? And so they do that, and they start going around door to door, and people are placing orders, and they're making all this money, and they keep doing it. They change their diet. They weren't eating well. They're eating cornflakes and milk, and so they go without the milk and use water on their cornflakes so they can save just a little bit more to put it in the jar. And they're doing this for weeks and weeks and weeks, and they're so happy, and they give it to the pastor to put in there, and the pastor goes around and goes, okay, well, who's the poorest family in town? And so he talks to the Salvation in town. He talks to the Ladies Auxiliary. He talks to the missions board, the committee, and the elders and the deacons of the church. And the family's excited. They're home. It's Christmas Eve. They're getting ready to celebrate their little Christmas they're going to have together, which is extremely simple fare. And they're like, man, I wonder if pastor's given that offering to that family yet. Maybe they'll get saved. Maybe he can invite them to church. They're all excited. They're talking about, we should pray for that. And then they get the knock on the door. And they go, and there's Pastor Thomas. Pastor Thomas, why are you here? He said, what happened? Do you need more money for the offering? Is something else wrong? No. Everybody agrees. What do you mean everybody agrees? Everybody, the deacons agree, the Salvation Army agrees, it's unanimous. Everybody agrees. This offering's for you. And the plot twist is that out of $141, which granted, 1949, but out of $141, the family had given over 120 of it. Only $19 came from outside this family. And so the pastor's giving it to the family, and of course he's embarrassed because he knows this. He's probably one of the few people anywhere that knows this. This family, the poorest family in town, gives 6 times more money than everybody else, and they're the poorest family in town. so often the poorest give the most, and that was certainly true of the church in Macedonia. They were giving, and they didn't have it. Corinth was on the opposite spectrum. Corinth was affluent. That harbor brought in a ton of money, a ton of funds, constantly changing. I actually had a pie chart in one of my commentaries. I can't even tell you the last time I've had a pie chart in one of my commentaries, but I actually had one. And it was the economic breakdown of what first century biblical era and times were. 73% of the population of any given area was at or below the poverty line. About 10% was at the poverty line. And only a very few handful were like what you would consider like elite and lived like kings. There's no middle class. So basically everybody is subsistence living. You go out, you work all day so you can buy your dinner at night, and then you wake up the next day to do it all over again. That's how it was. That probably is a great description of what the Macedonians were. And yet they're giving, and in fact he says they're begging. They're begging. Verse 4, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. Please let us give. It is that family. They're the poorest family in town. They're the poorest church in Paul's network. Please, let us give to you funds to help relieve the poor. I can't help but think that these Macedonians were giving funds to help people that were probably better off than they were, even in desperate times. And here's the Corinthians, who were far better off, far more affluent, and they're having a hard time following through on what they already had promised they would do. What had happened? The Macedonians had been moved by God. They've been moved by God. Should we be like the Macedonians? No. No. Lots of people give. Sometimes just because they see human suffering, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But that should never be our motivating factor. It wasn't theirs. They weren't moved by the suffering that was going on in Jerusalem. They were moved by God. Their relationship with God was what was pushing them to do this. Jerusalem was just a way in which they could express that. The horizontal always must follow the vertical. When this is right, this is right. And for them, their relationship with God was so deep and so mature that when they saw human need, they were like, oh great, we love God. How can we love God better? Let's give what God has given to us and help other people because of what we have in Christ, what we have in God. They were gripped by Christ, not by their wallets. Their money was not their treasure. Their food was not their treasure. God was their treasure. And so they had no trouble reaching in their pockets and throwing in coins into this offering. I truly think that because we have it so well in this country, we often struggle giving it away. The Huffington Post actually had an article back in, I think it was 2014, detailing things that, you remember 2008 with the housing crisis, the boom and the bust and all that kind of stuff that was going on in there. And they actually followed and tracked from 2006 to 2012 the spending habits of people, the upper tier and the lower tier. And so what's amazing is when that economic downturn died, crashed, fell, the poorest gave more and the wealthiest gave less. And you could see it. You could see it. And how do they define those things? Well, they had rich, basically, everybody was like $200-some thousand and up, which, it's 200 is the bottom, and then it up is a long ways up. And their giving decreased by like 4 or 5%. And then the poor, which was like 100,000 and down, you realize it's a very quick bottom as compared to the top. But they increased their giving, I want to say almost by like 6%. Because they knew people were suffering. And there was a greater need and said, we want to give more. But they had less to give. They had a smaller, shorter well. They had less to dip from and pull from, and yet they gave more when they arguably had less. Why? Why is that? Because I think of all the ways that we have, we can spend, we just find more and more ways to spend money. We can buy clothes and jewelry and food and nicer houses, but they can do that stuff too. But I think when we have more money, we have more options available to us, and all of a sudden it's not just I have a TV, but I need a bigger TV. Have a car. Or I want, to modify my car, modify my tractor. See, I pay attention to you guys. We need a bigger phone, a faster phone, a bigger phone. My wife is, where is she? There she is. She's like, are you going to talk about tools, preacher? I will talk about tools. I love tools. There are always more tools to buy. And they convince you of that, right? They convince you because they can make it more powerful, more smaller, more cordless, more like everything else. And it's so much better than the model that came out 2 years ago. That was better than the model that came out 2 years before that. It used to be you bought a drill. I still have a drill that's probably 70 years old. I'm not kidding. I bought it used, of course. But, it's like a 1/4-inch metal thing. It still works. It looks like you're going to get electrocuted every time you plug it in, but it still works. It still works. But you know what? They convince us all the time. Like, you need more. You need fancier. You need better. And we have money. It's like, yeah, but I can afford that. I can buy that. I have to have the latest and the greatest. And we're constantly told and convinced of that. And it is within our reach most of the time. I need more treasure. I think sometimes when you're poor, that's just not how you think. The Macedonians thought, we can help some people out. Does that mean that everybody's deserving? No. But it is easy to just lean out the window sometimes and say, hey, get a job. It is easy to say that. It is. Every once in a while I find myself in a bigger city and you see the homeless there. Sometimes they're obviously veterans that for whatever something happened, whether it's PTSD, something else happened, maybe they've been injured, they're just not, maybe not PTSD, but something's broken, something's wrong. Sometimes you just look at people, you don't know what's going on with them. And it's easy to just get a job. There's McDonald's right there. Walk in, get a job, good to go. It's easy. You don't know their story. You don't know what happened. I was challenged once by someone who said, he lives there all the time, and he was talking to people, and he goes, I don't want to stand before God someday and hear him say, that how much did you give? No, nothing, because I didn't want to be taken advantage of by people. Okay, well, that's good. We don't want to be taken advantage of people. But then that'd be like, but you never gave anything. He said, and he's not, God's not going to sit there and say, well done, nobody ever took advantage of you. You showed them, you saw through it every single time. Is that really what God's going to say? Or is he going to say, why did you never show compassion? They're going to rip me off. Yeah, they are. They are going to rip you off. But I would much rather stand before God having been ripped off and yet having genuine compassion for other people and trying to help out, because certainly for all those that are ripping you off, there are certainly those out there that are just struggling. And you never gave them anything. I'd rather be ripped off. Now, does that mean anything goes? No. We can use discernment. We should use wisdom. Sometimes you can give them $1, sometimes you just give them a sandwich. We can do various things. But we should be known as compassionate people. We should be known as generous people. I want to be known as a generous people. I think you are a generous people. We're a generous church. But we could probably always do more. Generous to other people, generous to other ministries, generous to strangers, generous to your own kids. Or are you a minimalist? I give my 10% to God because I feel that that's what he says, but it'll never be anything more. I mean, you do realize Menards gives you 11. Just saying. I don't want to guilt you into this. I don't want to guilt you into it. And I don't think what Paul is doing here is trying to guilt anybody into just giving more to the Macedonians or to the Corinthians or anybody else. I don't think that's what he's doing. But I think it's important that we realize how much of a hold our money really can and does have on us sometimes. And it stops us from being generous. I don't think we have to give until we're broke. But are you generous with what God has given to you? Maybe that's your money, maybe that's your time. It could be a lot of other things, but are you generous? Are we known as a generous people? I know how hard that can be, especially towards others. But I also know how obsessed I can be over material things. And maybe you are too. They were moved by God. Quickly, we're given this call to love. This call to love, really what Paul is talking to them. And he says this, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith and in speech and knowledge and all earnestness and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. We see Paul just sending Titus back down. There's something that had been started probably months earlier, and he just wants to finish this out. Will you now give? Titus is on his way to collect. And he says, you're so good in everything else. You're good in your faith. You're good in your service. You're good in all these other things. Will you not also be good in this area as well? And helping your fellow man is an expression of your love of God. What do you love more? Your God or your money? I think often when we have these opportunities like this, we do prove, right, that we're giving some of the way, that it does not have a hold on me. But it's hard to do. It is hard to do that. It is hard to prove that money doesn't have a hold on us. And yet when we give it away, sometimes even in small increments and sometimes in large, we're actually proving and showing, look, this is not my idol. This is not my God. And so we give it lovingly and freely. As I said, it doesn't mean that we give to every charity that we see. It doesn't mean we give it to every person that we see. But will you be generous? Will you be generous? And generosity is really modeled after the generosity that Christ has already shown to you. Paul is actually going to be his argument starting at verse 9. We'll see that. We're going to get to that later, but we understand that generosity that's there. Why does God want us to be generous? Because he's already been generous with us. He's given us what we do not deserve in Christ. He says, now model that to others. And obviously we can't all go to a cross. But we can give what most would consider some of the most precious things that we have, our wealth, our money, and give it to others. The love the Macedonians was giving with this offering came from the fact that they first give themselves to God. And then it really wasn't that difficult to give themselves to others then either. And if we struggle with that, we have to question ourselves a little bit here too. Have we really given ourselves to God? Let's pray. Lord, I just pray that you would help us with this text to consider what's being laid out for us and what the motivating factor behind the Macedonians in giving so much, and the challenge that ensued to the Corinthians. Where is your love? Where is our love? It's always a good question, because I think it can shift. I think it can fade. I think it can move. But Lord, to be so motivated by a relationship and our love of you that we wantingly give what you have provided. Lord, plenty of people have modeled this for us. We see it is quite possible. But Lord, may we be motivated not just by suffering and trial and difficulty, but that we might be moved instead by the greatest act of generosity this world has ever seen, as you sent your Son to die on a cross for us. Lord, that becomes our model. That we not be like the Macedonians, but that we might be like Christ. I pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.